Why do we say crossing the Rubicon? There are moments in history that feel small when they happen, almost ordinary, until the consequences begin to unfold. A road is taken, a door is open, a single decision is made, and after that, life can't return to what it was. That is exactly why, more than 2,000 years later, we still say someone has crossed the Rubicon. It's a phrase we use when a person commits to a choice so decisive, so irreversible, that there is simply no turning back. In January of 49 BC, Julius Caesar approached a shallow river in northern Italy called the Rubicon. It wasn't a dramatic, roaring boundary. In fact, it was the kind of threshold a traveler might cross without thinking. But for Rome, it was loaded with meaning. Roman law drew a strict line between a general's military authority and the political heart of the Republic. A commander could wage war outside Italy. But if he marched an army across that boundary into Roman territory, it would be treated as an act of war against the state itself. In other words, the Rubicon wasn't just a river, it was a warning, a final line. Cross it with an army, and you were no longer a loyal servant of the Republic. You were a rebel. By the time Caesar reached that river, he was already a legend. For 8 years, he had fought in Gaul, what is now parts of France, Belgium, Switzerland, Germany, and beyond. He didn't just win battles, he transformed Rome's map, pushing the Republic's boundaries outward and bringing home wealth, reputation, and glory. His soldiers admired him because he shared hardships with them, rewarded loyalty, and led from the front. To his enemies, that loyalty was terrifying, because a general with a devoted army is not just a military figure, he is a political threat. Back in Rome, another man watched Caesar's rise with growing concern. Pompey. Once Caesar's ally, Pompey had been one of the Republic's most celebrated generals and a powerful statesman. At one point, Caesar and Pompey had been linked through political partnership and mutual benefit. But Rome's politics were a shifting landscape, and alliances rarely lasted. As Caesar's victories piled up, the balance of power began to tilt. Senators who feared Caesar's popularity began to whisper to Pompey, "Caesar is too ambitious. Caesar is dangerous. Caesar will not be satisfied with honors. He will want control." By the late 50s BC, the old political arrangement that had kept Caesar, Pompey, and the wealthy Crassus aligned had shattered. Crassus was dead. The Senate was increasingly hostile. And Pompey, once the man Rome admired, now found himself pulled closer to the senators who feared Caesar's return. When the Gallic Wars were nearing their end, the Senate issued demands. Caesar was ordered to demobilize, to give up command, and return to Rome without the protection of his army. On the surface, it sounded like a legal request. In reality, it was a trap. Caesar believed that if he returned as a private citizen, without soldiers, he would be exposed to prosecution by political enemies eager to destroy him. Rome's courts were not neutral in these power struggles. Caesar had spent years making enemies. And in Rome, enemies didn't simply argue against you, they tried to end you. Caesar attempted to negotiate. One proposal became central. He would give up his army if Pompey gave up his. It was a way to level the field, to prevent Rome from having one powerful general armed while another was forced to surrender. But Pompey and the Senate rejected the idea. They wanted Caesar disarmed while Pompey remained backed by authority and potential force. Then came the breaking point. The Senate publicly declared Caesar an enemy of the state. That declaration mattered because it reframed the entire situation. Caesar was no longer merely a general finishing a campaign. He was now officially branded a threat. At that moment, Caesar understood something brutally simple. If he accepted their terms, he would likely be ruined or destroyed. If he resisted, Rome would call him a traitor. Either way, the old system was closing in around him. So Caesar did what desperate people sometimes do when they see no safe path forward. He chose the path that gave him agency. He chose force. He gathered around 5,000 troops and moved to the city of Ariminum, modern-day Rimini, just a short distance from the Rubicon. It was winter. The weather was cold. Armies were not in active campaigning mode. Many of Rome's forces were scattered or not prepared for immediate movement. That timing would matter more than anyone expected. And then on January 11th, 49 BC, Caesar crossed. What's striking about the event is how undramatic it may have looked in the moment. There was no grand battle at the river, no walls, no massive defense line waiting for him. In fact, as historians note, there may have been no one there to stop him at all. The Senate had granted Pompey the authority to raise forces, but they were not ready in time. Caesar's speed was the weapon. While others were still thinking in terms of political procedure, Caesar was already moving. The crossing itself was a statement. The law no longer protected Caesar, and Caesar no longer felt bound by the law. Soon after, Caesar marched south with shocking momentum. The Senate had expected him to stay in Gaul, to consolidate, to hesitate, to bargain. Instead, he went on the offensive. The suddenness of the move created panic in Rome. Pompey and many senators loyal to him evacuated Italy, abandoning the city rather than risk being trapped. The capital of the Republic, so proud of its institutions, was suddenly a prize that could be taken by the man who moved first. This was the moment when the Roman Republic's internal contradictions became impossible to ignore. For nearly 5 centuries, Rome had maintained a system where elected officials and elite families shared power through institutions, tradition, and law. But the Republic also created powerful generals. It gave men armies, provinces, and opportunities for glory, and then expected them to surrender everything peacefully when politics demanded it. Caesar's march exposed the reality. When the stakes became existential, power did not always bow to principle. The civil war that followed was not a single battle, but a series of campaigns across multiple regions. Pompey retreated to the east, eventually reaching Greece. Caesar, now controlling resources in Rome, drew on the treasury to fund war and used his charisma, his ability to speak and persuade, to expand his following. Senators were forced to choose sides. Neutrality became dangerous. Battles took place across Spain, Greece, and North Africa. Caesar's military talent, experience, and the discipline of his loyal troops pushed the conflict forward. The decisive moment came in August 48 BC at the Battle of Pharsalus, where Caesar defeated Pompey's forces. Pompey fled, hoping to find safety in Egypt, but was assassinated before he could even step ashore. The irony was cruel. The man who had been granted power to defend the Republic died far from Rome, killed not by Caesar directly, but by the politics of another kingdom. The war did not end immediately. Caesar continued fighting opponents and stabilizing control until 45 BC, defeating remaining resistance. But something deeper had already changed, something that could not be repaired even if every battle ended cleanly. Once Caesar crossed the Rubicon, the old Republican idea, that power was shared and no single figure should dominate, began to collapse. People in Rome saw what force could do. They learned that a dominant figure could seize the state if institutions could not resist him. The precedent was set. Even those who hated Caesar understood the lesson. In 44 BC, Caesar named himself dictator for life. It was a title that sent chills through the Senate. Rome had once expelled kings and celebrated the Republic as a system designed to prevent one man from ruling permanently. But Caesar's reforms and pardons complicated the picture. He forgave former enemies like Brutus and Cassius, believing, perhaps naively, that reconciliation was possible. He attempted to reduce debts and redistribute land to ease social pressures. To some, he looked like a stabilizer. To others, he looked like a man consolidating absolute power. And as Caesar's authority grew, so did symbolic acts that alarmed Rome's elite. Coins bearing his image, honors that elevated him above traditional limits, rumors of monarchy, displays of power that felt less like leadership and more like ownership of the state. For senators raised on the ideology of shared rule, Caesar had become proof that the Republic could be bent into something else. So they plotted. On March 15th, 44 BC, the Ides of March, Caesar was assassinated by a group of senators led by figures such as Brutus and Cassius. They believed they were saving the Republic. But instead, they created a vacuum. Caesar's death did not restore the old order. It unleashed more conflict, more civil wars, and eventually a new political reality. By 27 BC, Octavian, later known as Augustus, held absolute power and effectively became Rome's first emperor, even if he used careful titles like Princeps, the first citizen. The Republic lived on in name, But its core had shifted. The world Caesar stepped into when he crossed that small river was not the same world that emerged afterward. And that is why crossing the Rubicon endures as a metaphor. It isn't simply about physical movement across a boundary. It's about a decision that changes the rules of your life. A moment where hesitation ends and commitment begins. Once Caesar crossed, he could not uncross. Even if he had wanted peace later, the act itself forced everyone else to respond. It turned uncertainty into inevitability. The phrase is often paired with another line attributed to Caesar in that moment. The die is cast. Whether he truly said it exactly that way is debated, but the meaning is clear. A die thrown in a game cannot be unthrown. The outcome is now in motion. You can only watch it unfold. And perhaps that is the quiet power of the story. The Rubicon was easy to traverse, small, even unimpressive, but it represented a boundary that existed not in nature, but in law, tradition, and political order. When Caesar crossed it, he proved that those invisible lines matter until someone decides they don't. So today, when we say someone has crossed the Rubicon, we're not talking about Rome alone. We're talking about any moment where a person makes a choice that commits them to a new path, a path where going back is no longer possible, a step that seems small at first, but reshapes everything that follows.